Stanford University.
Welcome to Stanford Medicine's 11th Annual Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, the founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It's my deep honor to introduce our next teacher, Sharon Salzberg, who will be teaching on the topic of compassion and joy, practicing the Dharma in times of uncertainty. Sharon Salzberg is a meditation pioneer, world-renowned teacher, and New York Times best-selling author. She was among the first to bring mindfulness and loving-kindness meditation to mainstream American culture 50 years ago, inspiring generations of meditation teachers and wellness influencers. Sharon is co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and the author of 13 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Real Happiness, now in its second edition, and her seminal work, Loving Kindness. Sharon's podcast, The Meta Hour, has amassed 6 million downloads and features interviews with thought leaders from the mindfulness movement and beyond. Without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Sharon Salzberg.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be with all of you and to be talking about some of the qualities of mind that make me happy to consider and to talk about and to explore. So I do consider this both today and tomorrow, that kind of exploration. So the first kind of model, when I think about qualities like compassion and joy, the first model that comes to mind actually is those states that when we relate to them in a certain way tend to produce kind of contraction or constriction, real narrowness of perception and loss of options in our life. And then those states which do the opposite, which expand our view and open us and have us feel connected rather than disconnected. And so the idea of contraction or constriction, that narrowing isn't actually the same thing as focusing or being one-pointed or being centered or being contained. In fact, we can be specific and determined and intentional without being constricted. For a moment, like right now, just think of the last time you felt maybe really lost in fear, or when you felt really harshly unforgiving of yourself, or when you felt a craving so strong that it felt like in that moment all reason and common sense was fleeting. It was just gone. So many of us, can look back and remember really being infatuated with somebody, and then you look back some years later and you think, what was that about? Or if you consider the last time you felt trapped, that any sense of potential change or movement collapsed and you felt hopeless. All those states, because they are seductive, we can relate to them in such a way that they're overwhelming, produce that kind of constriction, and that narrowness is very different than being one-pointed. So when we are lost in those ways, lost in those states, we experience limited options. It's not a time when, for example, if you're deeply, deeply afraid and into it, it's not a time you're going to think, well, if it doesn't work out this way, maybe it'll work out that way. It's like it will never work out, right? We experience the blunting of our creativity, a sense of disconnection for sure. We experience the dimming of our vision of what might be possible. So it's not to say that that kind of constriction is bad or we're wrong to feel it. But if it becomes a steady state, we find we're living more and more in a kind of tunnel vision. And we're not hearing, we're not seeing, we have distorted perception, we have narrowed interests. The joy that might be right in front of us, really available, is something we miss because we just don't see it. So our perception of options, of possibility, of aliveness just fades and we suffer. So those are the states. I think of this other model, but very connected, that a friend of mine, Barbara Fredrickson, who's a researcher at the University of North Carolina, she studies positive states, like gratitude, joy, compassion, which is actually a positive state, loving kindness. And her first book, I think, was called Positivity. And in it, she laid out what has come to be known as the Fredrickson theory of broaden and build. And that is that certain states, when we cultivate them and when we enhance them, will broaden our perspective. It'll open us in these ways. We have a sense of expansion, and they build a sense of inner resource. And I related to that model as soon as I heard it, because right away I thought about the opposite. All the things I've just been describing, times when I have felt in the grips of fear or overcome by craving, or some state that I do feel stuck. I feel that tightness, that constriction. And so when she talks about cultivating or strengthening these other states, these positive states, it's not just like a feel good kind of thing, but it's really about that kind of openness and expansion in which many things become possible. And that's what we're really aiming for. I also think about what I've come to feel is like the stress dynamic. It's really a dynamic. There's the pressure, the circumstance, the incident, the situation kind of coming at us. And then there's the resource with which it's met. And we know that from an ordinary day, right? Like maybe you didn't sleep at all last night and you had a really unfriendly encounter with a family member at breakfast or a friend at breakfast. And then you go to work or you go into a classroom and you overhear a remark. And it's just so upsetting to you and you take it to heart and it like fills you. In contrast to you had a beautiful night's sleep and you had a lovely breakfast with a bunch of friends and felt that circle of love. And then you went to work or you went into the classroom and you overheard that remark. Maybe your response might be more like, person's having a bad day, it sounds like, right? It's not that all things kind of mush together and we have no kind of discernment or recognition, like maybe it was a pretty crummy remark, but we respond differently depending on what we bring to that moment. Now, sometimes people hear this kind of model and they just assume, well, that means you're not going to do anything. You're not going to engage in trying to seek change. You're not going to address maybe an unjust situation. You're just going to be working on that sense of inner resource, which is not true. I always say, well, if you're trying to seek change in a certain situation or dynamic, why do it from a place of maximum depletion and exhaustion and overwhelm? Why not build that sense of inner resource and sense of connection to others, which is another main part of that kind of resource? Why not build that so that we have these kind of strengths as we meet the ups and downs of life and the adversity and the challenges and so on, and the sheer stress. Um, and we look at our situation right now where anxiety seems through the roof, and it's just, it's a lot to bear sometimes. And yet, to be effective, to be efficient, to manifest connection, to take care of others, as well as ourselves means that we really need to look at the development of qualities. So my background really is in meditation training. I went to India as a university student, and I went in 1970. It was the beginning of my junior year. And um, I went specifically to learn how to meditate. I created an independent study project for the university I was going to because I'd heard about meditation. I did an Asian philosophy course when I was a sophomore, and I was going to college in Buffalo, New York. I looked around Buffalo. I just didn't see it anywhere. Something happened inside of me where I thought, I don't want to just read about this stuff. I don't want to just think, well, maybe I'll go to graduate school, and study it. I wanted to learn how to do it. And I just didn't see it. So I created this independent study project. And I said to the university, I want to go to India and learn how to meditate. And they said, great, go. So I went off with my student loans and my college scholarship uh, in pursuit of kind of practical, direct guidance to see if I might actually transform my mind. I think if I was going to describe myself at that age, I was 18 when I was a junior, and one word, I would have said fragmented. And yet I had some kind of intuition, which was wild because, I grew up in New York City. I went to college in Buffalo. I'd never even been to California before. And I decided I was going to go to India. And I was a very frightened person. I was very fragmented. And yet there was a kind of motivation and a belief, an intuition, really, that there were perhaps, as promised, methods, techniques, avenues I could pursue so that I could actually transform my mind. And that's kind of the basis of this idea that sometimes I find in the West, this idea of, say, compassion as one of these qualities, which is very expansive and connecting. Sometimes I think we're conditioned to think of something like compassion more as like a gift, and you either have it or you don't. And the idea that it can be developed, it can be engendered, it can be nurtured seems quite foreign to us. Whereas in the East, certainly in something like Buddhist psychology, absolutely all of these qualities can be cultivated because they're all considered products of learning how to pay attention differently. They will emerge. They're like emergent properties of paying attention differently. And we know that that's exactly what meditation is. It's learning how to pay attention differently. Whether we're meditating formally or we're bringing a kind of mindful presence into activities of daily life, it's all about learning how to pay attention differently, being more present, more focused, in fact, more open to experience, not holding on so fiercely to assumptions, to old impressions, being able to learn, having a sense of curiosity about our experience. Years ago, I was traveling back to the East Coast from New Mexico with some friends and their 4-year-old child, when all of a sudden, like, the child wandered off in the airport and she was lost. And because everyone of us, were kind of frantic looking for her. And we finally found the child thanks to a staff member who put an announcement on the PA system. And when we came together, the child was very upset and frightened and said accusingly to her mother, "You weren't where you were supposed to be." Of course, her mother had never left where she was supposed to be, but the child herself had wandered off. And that reminded me of the sense of betrayal and fear we can have when we discover that happiness, fulfillment, wholeness isn't where we'd expected it to be. You were not where you were supposed to be. And this, of course, is the result of a lot of conditioning. Again, within the Buddhist tradition, they say that everybody wants to be happy, and not a kind of conventional sense of happiness, which can be very superficial and fleeting, certainly not kind of happy-go-lucky or conflict avoidant, only seeking pleasure. We don't like need techniques for that. We do that anyway. We're conditioned to that. But a much deeper sense of happiness, like a sense of feeling at home somewhere in this body, in this mind, with one another on this planet, a sense of belonging, that we all yearn for that. We all want that. But because of conditioning, because of the force of habit, we have what one friend of mine termed bad aim. We seek happiness in places it is not going to be found. Endless accumulation, a sense of control over others, domination. One of my favorite sayings to take apart is, it's a dog eat dog world. And I guess it's up for grabs whether dogs actually eat dogs. I've heard both things, but it's a dog eat dog world, meaning don't help anybody else because they're not going to help you. And it doesn't matter who you have to step on in your search for fulfillment, for happiness or success, because it doesn't matter. And taking that up as a kind of ethic, of course, we get lonelier and lonelier, more and more cut off. It's never finally fulfilling. And we suffer and we struggle. Once I was co-leading this 6-day workshop, and I, in the first night, I was talking about it's a dog eat dog world, and this young woman raised her hands and she said, I never knew that that was the saying. It's a dog eat dog world. She said, I always thought it was a doggy dog world, like puppies jumping up and down in meadows, you know. She said, what a horrible saying. So then 6 days went by and we're having like a closing circle. And again, she went up to the microphone and she said, I've decided I'm not going to live in a dog eat dog world. I'm going to live in a doggy dog world. So sometimes it's seeing the difficulty, the constriction, it's actually feeling it, that is our goad to actually developing qualities that are more expansive and open and so on. And that doesn't mean we denigrate what we're feeling, you know, when we're afraid, when we're looking at uncertainty and we just feel overwhelmed or whatever it might be. It's actually important to change our relationship to all of those states, because that will be a big part of the path. So in terms of compassion, for example, sometimes we see our own anger, our fear, our jealousy, and we call it bad or wrong or terrible or weak. But just think what it would be like as a kind of thought experiment. Every time you saw one of those states arise within you, instead of calling them bad or wrong or whatever, or I'm such a terrible person, or I'm really ashamed of what I'm feeling, you kind of translated all of that into the word suffering. To be lost, to be overcome by fear is a state of suffering, or craving, or whatever it might be, and just see what happens in your own response to that state and how it transitions. We see that we have generally one of two extreme ways of relating to these more constricting states. And I should point out that I'm not talking about just feeling them. We feel what we feel, and in a way we have to allow every feeling the dignity of its own life, its own presence. But we tend to relate in one of two extreme ways. One is we get totally overcome by it. We take it to heart. It fills us, it defines us, it guides our choices, our decisions, the ways we act. So we have, in a way, become it. The other extreme is to really dislike what we're feeling and to feel that it's wrong. And, I should have gotten rid of this long ago. I've been meditating all this time, or I've spent all that money in therapy. Why is it still here? It's all wrong. And so we just get tighter and tighter and tighter till we explode. We talk about really a middle way, something in between, not getting lost in something or defined by it, and also not trying to push it away, being hostile, being afraid of the feeling itself. And we call that mindfulness. That's actually the middle way of relating. I think probably my favorite example of mindfulness in this light is something I read years and years ago in the New York Times about one of the very early pilot programs bringing mindfulness into the classroom. So this was a fourth grade classroom in Oakland, California. So the kids were maybe 9 or 10 years old. And the journalist asked one of the kids, "What is mindfulness? What is mindfulness?" And he replied by saying, "Mindfulness means not hitting someone in the mouth. That's what mindfulness means." And I thought that is a great definition of mindfulness. Because what does it imply? It implies knowing you're feeling annoyed or angry when you're starting to feel annoyed, not after it's escalated and it's so overwhelming. It also implies a certain balanced relationship to the anger. Again, if we get consumed by it, overwhelmed by it, we're likely to hit a lot of people in the mouth because life can be really frustrating. And yet, if you hate it, if you're afraid of it, you can't bear that that's what you're feeling, you get tighter and tighter and tighter. It's not going to work. So when we can be present without those reactions, really open to what we're experiencing, be mindful. What happens is that a kind of space opens up. And in that space, we do see options, we see possibilities, we see ways of acting that might not have been available to us when we were so caught. So I like to think of that kid, for example, in that class, being mindful of his anger, seeing that space, experiencing that space opening up and thinking, hit someone in the mouth last week. Didn't work out that well. Maybe I'll try my words or something, So it's kind of like that. It's not that we become passive or complacent, but we have so many more options. I think of another story of these friends of mine who have an organization called the Holistic Life Foundation, and they bring tools of like yoga and meditation practice, mindfulness practice to inner city schools in Baltimore. And they told me a story about a younger child. She was maybe 7 or something like that. And she was always in trouble. She was always in detention. These kids would tease her a lot for a variety of reasons. And she would fight back, but she would like just knock a kid out. And they taught her some meditation practice. And they said one day they went into like a public space, like an auditorium or cafeteria or something like that. And she was holding up another little girl by the throat up against the wall. And then she looked at her and she said, "You're just lucky I know how to meditate." And she dropped her. She went off and sat, right? And then kind of composed herself. So it's not freaking out over the kind of more entangling, difficult states that we feel, but right there, developing a more present, balanced, compassionate relationship to those states too. I also think of the story, which I've always liked, about this woman named Kate Braestrup, who is a chaplain working with the Forestry Service in Maine, and she works with search and rescue workers, and she recounts in a book she wrote being called out to sit with the parents of a then missing 6-year-old child who was later found alive and fine after many hours being lost in the woods. But at the time, just sitting with the parents, the little girl's mother said to her, "It's so cool that the warden service has a chaplain to keep us from freaking out." And Graystrup responded, "I'm not really here to keep you from freaking out. I'm here to be with you while you freak out." She knows that as a chaplain, it's not her job to kind of try to wrestle people's suffering away. Instead, she says, "I am there if they want to grieve or laugh or suffer or sing. It is a ministry of presence. It is showing up with a loving heart." So many healing modalities, like mindfulness meditation, are designed to help us cultivate a ministry of presence for ourselves, a space of forgiveness about what we're feeling, compassion, and openness in the face of our own inner pain. And we can sum that up as love. It's like a visceral, embodied knowing of connection with ourselves, with one another, and with life. So instead of either demanding that a painful emotion disappear or becoming all consumed by it, we start to relate to our experience, whatever it is, with spaciousness infused with kindness. We relate to ourselves with love, no matter what we're going through. And while we can't control life, we begin to affect change by profoundly transforming the space of whatever we feel, the space we hold it within. If we can do that, we have created the opportunity for a very active cultivation for more expansive and open states. So it's like an experiment we make. I think, for example, if you're the kind of person, as many of us are, who will evaluate yourself at the end of the day and evaluate the day, and you pretty much only remember the mistakes you made and the things you didn't say quite as well as you wished you had, and the ways someone else didn't show up for you, and the disappointment, you not only pay attention to it, you obsess about it, maybe you fixate on it. So the question becomes, if you're willing to ask yourself this, anything else happen today? Like anything good? Any good within me? It's not that we want to be conflict avoidant or pretend we are perfect or the day was just unparalleled and perfect. But in addition to the difficulties, we don't have to collapse into that. We can open, we can stretch. And so I call those kinds of practices where we cultivate positive states a stretch. What happens when you think anything else happened today? Anything good? So gratitude is one of those practices. Anything good happened today? And a lot of people, kind of diminish gratitude, and they put it down and they say, well, that's like saying, I'm in this terrible situation and it's so unfair and I'm just going to be grateful for little crumbs and I'm not going to ever try to make a difference. And it's really not true. And I've talked to researchers about gratitude and like David DeSteno at Northeastern, who would say to me, gratitude has two principal functions. One, it energizes us, it strengthens us, so that if we are seeking change in a system, in a situation, we have some juice, we have some energy going. And the other thing he said was gratitude has people want to pay it forward. So remember what it was like for you, and you want to help someone else get a break or get ahead or have an opportunity or something like that. And so we do more if we practice gratitude. When we practice positive states like compassion, gratitude, I'll say joy is a positive state. One of the things it produces is a kind of resilience to be able to face uncertainty, adversity, challenge, to transform our relationship to those states. We have to have, in a way, enough light to surround the darkness. We need enough space, the space that's big enough to hold the painful experience and not collapse into it. We can cultivate that sense of space by taking the time to practice positive states. And we can do that. It is really, it's within our power, not just to take for granted our limitation around these things, but to stretch, to experiment, and then decide for ourselves. Remember Barbara Fredrickson, they're not just feel-good states. They help us broaden our scope of awareness so that we can experience a wider arrays of thoughts and actions and perceptions. They build our sense of inner resource of available strength, and it gives us a deeper resilience to meet life with whatever comes our way. And resilience, too, is a kind of funny concept some these days. I was going to speak at this gala some years ago, where different nonprofits will put on like a big fundraising evening and there are talks and dinner and things like that. And so I was going to be one of the speakers, and before it was my turn to speak, they had just placed me arbitrarily at somebody's table, so I could wait. And I was sitting at this table, and the person whose table it was turned to me and said, "Well, I hope you're not going to talk about resilience. I was just at a resilience lunch today." Of course, I've been exactly planning that, to talk about resilience. So I sat there and thought, what else can I call it? So resilience, not just in a sense, I did talk about resilience. Resilience, not just in the sense of bouncing back, which is the ordinary way of defining it, but even being able to move on, to flourish, to discover, to learn, to have less kind of automatic reactivity and more curiosity, more openness when we have adversity, we have challenge, and we certainly have challenges, really. So all of these cultivations of positive states actually produce a much greater kind of resilience. So let's talk about compassion and joy most specifically. So again, going back to the Buddhist psychology, compassion is defined as the trembling or the quivering of the heart in response to seeing pain or suffering. So it's a movement of the heart, and it's a movement toward to see if we can be of help. Now, this is different than a moving into the state of suffering to burn up ourselves. It's also different than a movement toward to seize control and be the savior and definitely be of help. The trembling or the quivering of the heart in response to seeing pain or suffering, it's a movement of the heart. It's a movement toward to see if we can be of help. So these days, as you probably know, there is a distinction that's sometimes made in research between empathy and compassion, even though in ordinary English usage, we use them as those synonyms. So empathy, in a way, is the first part of that definition, the trembling or the quivering of the heart. It's really a a resonance, it's a responsiveness when we see pain or suffering. And then there's the second part of the definition, the movement toward, to see if we can be of help. And empathy is almost like, in this definition, it's like an essential building block toward the compassionate response, that movement toward. But compassion is not inevitable, even when we genuinely feel empathy. And we live in a time where, there can be a lot of emphasis on empathy training, and you can see it can be a really cold, cruel world without enough empathy. But I've seen, for example, I do a lot of work with caregivers, people who either in their personal lives or professional lives are in some ways on the front edge of somebody's suffering and trying to make a difference. And they've got huge amounts of empathy. They're burning out for some other reason, definitely, which we can talk about. But it's not from a lack of empathy. So we might have great empathy, truly, but then we're frightened by the suffering that we see and we just want to run away. Or we're so tired to begin with. It's like, I just got to go back to bed. I'm overwhelmed. I can't handle it. And we know this, right? Like you're having a really bad time and you're exhausted and a friend comes over, or, a stranger, somebody comes over and starts telling you their very sad story. And all you can think is like, go away. I can't take it in, right? Or maybe we do have that kind of strange control thing, like, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to be the one. I can fix it right away. Or like I have a therapist, kind of acquaintance that I was having a conversation with, and he said to me, I went through this like 6-month period that was really strange where every time a client would be telling me their story, I would just be blaming them in my mind. I think, I told you what to do 6 months ago. If you'd only done it, you'd be a lot better off. There's so many ways we might respond, even when we do have empathy. Or we can have the compassionate response, the movement toward, to see if we can be of help. Compassion, whether looking at ourselves or looking at somebody else, is based on an awareness of suffering. And it's not that we all suffer to the same degree or the same amount, because we don't. But we're all vulnerable to uncertainty, to change, to insecurity. So sometimes people misconstrue compassion as a kind of hierarchical state, like whose life is so perfect, I'm way up here. And I'm just throwing this little bit of kindness down on you, way down there, because your life has fallen apart, which mine never, ever could. Well, guess what? It could. So compassion is actually much more of a kind of state of equality, of understanding that. And in terms of self-compassion, it's like giving yourself a break. It's not ignoring or pretending everything's just fine. Sometimes we make mistakes and they're very consequential, and we need to try to rectify that or make amends or something like that. But the kind of endless harping on ourselves and ferocious self-criticism, it's just not onward leading. It's depleting, it's debilitating, it's devastating. Whereas self-compassion, recognizing, yes, I made a mistake. What can I learn from this? Feeling sometimes the pain or the regret, but moving on, having the energy to move on is much more useful. And just using the example of meditation practice, maybe we'll get to do a little bit together today even. You might have many different techniques or styles of meditation. The first instruction I ever got when I got to India was in January of 1971. I went into this intensive 10-day meditation retreat led by S.N. Goenka, who had just left Burma to India and began teaching. And the very first instruction I received from him was sit down and feel your breath. Just feel the sensations of the natural in and out breath. And my very first thought was, that's so stupid. I came all the way to India. Where's the magical, esoteric, fantastic technique that's just going to clear away all my suffering and make me a totally happy person? And then I thought, how hard can this be? What'll it be, like 800 breaths, 900 breaths before my mind wanders? And to my absolute shock, it was like one breath, or sometimes two breaths, sometimes half a breath, and I'd be gone, and I'd be way gone. And each time I thought I failed, I'm terrible, I'm the worst at this. It's just hideous. It took me a very long time to understand what I was doing. So imagine sitting there, feeling the breath, you get lost thought, and then you realize it. And what we usually do is jump on the train. I can't believe I'm thinking. No one else in the room is thinking. They're not thinking. They're sitting here in bliss. They're sitting here bathed in white light. I'm the only one who's thinking. Why am I thinking? I'm so stupid. I'm so bad. They're perfect. They're not thinking. Or maybe they are thinking, but they're thinking beautiful thoughts. They're thinking wonderful thoughts. Why am I thinking such stupid, prosaic thoughts? It's like, I'm so boring. I'm so awful, right? That's what we tend to do. And if we do that, not only have we extended the period of time of the distraction, sometimes considerably, but we're so exhausted. We're so demoralized at the end of that. In contrast to, you sit down, you feel your breath, you realize you've been lost in thought, you recognize that, see if you can gently let go, and with some compassion for yourself, come back. You start again, you begin again. So as disdainful as I was in the beginning, over time, I began to see that ability to kind of give yourself a break, have some perspective, be kind to yourself was the most effective way to change a habit, to make progress in something, to move on with something. It's not being deluded or ignoring some real problems. It's approaching them differently. And this too, we're capable of. We're capable of learning the skill, as tempting as all the other stuff is. I don't think I've ever taught, we'll see what happens with you all, I've ever taught about self-compassion without somebody raising their hand and saying, well, that's just laziness. That's just saying, so what? I made a mistake. Forgive myself. I'll make another mistake. Who cares? But it's really not. Think about how many times a day do we have to begin again? It's like we fall down, we have to pick ourselves up or let others help us up. We start over. But we go into a meeting with a really fixed idea about the resolution to a problem. We cannot listen to anything else. And then we do have a moment, we really say, oh, that's kind of maybe a better idea. We change course every day. So I really began to see that was the most valuable thing in a way I was taking from meditation practice. So it was almost like the really big life lessons can happen in these itty bitty little packages. So compassion, it's exploring it as a strength rather than a weakness. It's exploring the possibility of cultivating it, of engendering it, of paying attention differently, of stretching and experimenting and seeing what happens as we consider that. Compassion for ourselves as well as compassion for others. Compassion for others combined with wisdom. It's like back to those caregivers. First of all, that imbalance of compassion for others and not for oneself can be very strong. Self-care is maybe not the most predominant trait. If you're trying to take care of others, if you're trying to make a change in society, activists fall into the same kind of dynamic, very much so. And it's not selfish. It's not wrong to try to find a greater balance, to have some compassion for yourself instead of unrealistic standards and never allowing for the development of resilience. And I've done many programs for caregivers, first responders, and hospice nurses, and people in their families taking care of somebody, and domestic violence shelter workers, and domestic violence shelter supervisors, and all kinds of people. And even people who say in their friendship dynamics, they're the caregiver. It's very hard for them to receive. They're the giver in some way. And I remember doing, what became a 4-year program for domestic violence shelter workers and then shelter directors and supervisors. And the directors and supervisors started talking about creating what they called a culture of wellness at work. That was their term. And there were a lot of different things people talked about to try to help create a culture of wellness, rooftop garden, healthier snacks, and things like that. And one woman said, I think in order to try to create a culture of wellness at work, I'm going to have to start taking a lunch break. Now, remember, culture might mean your body and mind, it might mean your desk, your team, your lab, your shelter. She said, I'm going to have to start taking a lunch break. And everyone in the room who did not work at a shelter was completely aghast. And we said, you don't take a lunch break? Isn't it in your contract? And she said, oh, it's in my contract, but it's never enough time. And there's always like an emergency. And she said, but you know what? I realized I can't go on too much longer unless I learn to take a break. So because we were meeting in between retreats, we got the chance to check on her progress. And the first time she came in, like maybe 2 weeks later, she said, it didn't work. She said, I closed the door, but someone crouched down and looked through the keyhole and saw that I was in there, so I didn't get a lunch break. And then maybe 3 weeks later, she came in and she was beaming and she said, it worked. She said, I closed the door and turned off the lights and I got a break. So think about that, right? And I kept thinking, probably the hardest part in that whole adventure was realizing she needed it and she was going to go for it. It's not wrong to have that kind of compassion for yourself. Then I took that sort of model. I was working with military caregivers, chaplains and medics and people like that. And we would always start with having people either through journaling or reflection, let's say journaling, write down in one column what they did for themselves, for resilience, for new perspective, for opening. And then in the next column, we'll look back at what they had just written down and reflect on it. And if they have any commentary about it, to write that down. So this one man wrote down, I go out in nature, I kayak, it makes such an enormous difference. And then in the next column, he wrote down, I haven't done it in about 7 years. This is a true story. Think about that. So we cultivate compassion, not only for others, but also for ourselves. And it takes balance to really actualize that cultivation. And I just want to say a little bit about joy, which comes in many forms. Awe is one of the forms of joy, feeling kind of that elevation, feeling inspired, will open us. It expands our vision of what's possible, even though usually we say awe and we think of feeling small, but it's not small in a kind of constricted way of limitation. It's connection to something bigger. that's actually in a way inviting us to that something bigger. And when I was first wanting to write about awe, and so I was reading about it, and I just thought, because the only bits of research I saw were things like people going off to the redwood forest and looking at the majestic, magnificent trees and feeling awe. So I thought it was, largely that. And then I read on and I reflected on my own experience, and it's absolutely true. I mostly feel awe seeing the goodness in people, the way that people can rise up, in some really tough situations, take care of one another. I have a friend who had just moved to Asheville, before the hurricane, before the flood, and there you go. I'm a first responder in Asheville. And I'll go on and tell her story. Uh, she's a friend who started an organization many years ago in the beginning of the pandemic. She woke up one morning and she said, you can make two Google Docs. One is I need help, like paying rent or something like that. And the other is I can offer help, like I can offer a month's rent or something like that. And she said, you just pair them together. So she started an organization, which is kind of a non-organization called Pandemic of Love. And first she would just pair, I say it's not a non-organization because the money doesn't go to the organization. It's just like putting people together. Although occasionally now, sometimes they take in money and do bigger projects, but she just started pairing people, and then it grew and grew. And then she, had to get volunteers to start pairing people, and it became kind of international. And then after some time, she was deemed a CNN hero. And the last time I looked at Pandemic of Love, they had people had exchanged over $70 million, out of that. So she had just moved to Asheville before the hurricane. And there is trauma, no doubt. It's devastation. Um, and there's fear for others. Her mother had moved. I mean, it was just like, as everyone's situation, there is exhaustion, there is grieving, and there's great complication. But there's also um, her way, which came forward. It's like so much was stripped away, and that impulse, okay, how can I help? So she just started Pandemic of Love right there, and other projects. So I wouldn't say joy in the sense of pleasure or delight, like I'm so glad this is happening. And in fact, I think we need to avoid that, because that's an imposition on myself. Like I should be grateful for this, or so many lessons learned. There should, that's ridiculous, but it is a kind of pressure we often put on ourselves. I wrote a book some years ago. I think that one was Real Love. And I turned in the manuscript. And when I heard from the publisher, he responded to me by saying, I read your book. I think it's really good. And the part I liked the most was when you quoted the Zen teacher, Roshi Joan Halifax, who's a friend of mine, where she said something like, you shouldn't try to force yourself to see the traumas of your life as gifts. She said they're givens. That's what they are. They're givens. And sometimes people do see them as gifts. They got a terrible diagnosis or whatever, but that's genuine. That's not an imposition, but they're givens. This is the situation. And we grieve and we wish it were otherwise, but it's not otherwise. And we move on. And often we move on through connection to others. We really do. If you're a first responder, if you're a giver, sometimes you also need to spend some time caring for yourself. And it's very tough. Of all kind of psychological makeups, it tends to be the one where it's really kind of hard. to receive as well as to give, and yet taking some time for that guy to go out kayaking, to allow yourself to enjoy something like to let others help you, maybe, if that's an issue. Like at my very first retreat in January of 1971, one of the people that I met was Ramdas, who was also there as a student. And we became friends, and we were friends through the years of his, both of our coming back to the States and his being this kind of pioneering figure in spirituality. And he was the first person I knew working with dying people, working with prisoners. And he was a giver, and he was always taking care of somebody. And he was also the kind of person, having known him so well, it was very hard for him to receive anything. Like you couldn't even give him a birthday present exactly. It was like kind of tough. And then he had this massive stroke, and he wasn't expected to live, but he did live. And he was in a wheelchair. And if you've ever heard any of his talks before he had the stroke, he had this incredible eloquence. And then he had aphasia after the stroke and long halting silences, and whatever. And yet he got up, he did public speaking. And he moved to Maui, and I was there, teaching with him, but he was doing this session, not with me. And I was sitting in the back of the room, like behind 300 people. And he was up on the stage, and he said, after the stroke, the most difficult thing for me, harder than living in a wheelchair, harder than pain, physical pain, harder than the changes in my speech, was being able to receive help, being able to accept it. He said it was the hardest thing, but the most liberating. And then one of his famous books that he'd written or co-written was called How Can I Help? And he said, now I feel like writing a book called How Can You Help Me? So we just look at those dynamics and understand the pain is real, and you should never try to deny it. The trauma is, overwhelming. And if you're exhausted, you need to kind of think about your nervous system and helping receive in some way that will help replenish, because that will only help the work. That's how we can go on. And sometimes, we feel we don't deserve it. There's so much suffering around us. And yet here too, we have to kind of examine resilience and see what it's made of, because resilience will be one of the things that will allow us to keep doing the work. Otherwise, it is just all too much, and times of uncertainty are just all too much. And we need to connect with others in some way. If you're not in a role where you're helping people kind of spontaneously, or, in a non uh, formal way, think about it. And it doesn't have to be a grandiose gesture. It can be thanking people, paying attention to them, smiling at them. But I also remember teaching in New York City in early March 2020. So that combination of words should evoke a lot. New York City in early March 2020. People's parents were getting sick. Some people's parents were dying. Anxiety was through the roof. Nobody knew what was really happening with this virus, and it was really terrifying. And I was teaching in a room where it was a basement room, and no windows, and everyone was super anxious. And it was a place where the speaker would be sitting amongst the participants in the front row until they were formally introduced. Then they'd go up on the stage and speak. And I was still sitting in the front row, and this woman next to me was practically jumping out of her skin with anxiety. And she said, I don't know if I should come. And it was just like, and I said, well, there are certain breathing techniques, which there are. One of which, for example, would be if your out breath is longer than your in breath, then it seems to help cool out your nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system takes over from the sympathetic nervous system, and you can get more relaxed. And so I said, well, there's some breathing techniques that, said to really help. She wasn't at all interested. And I said, well, there's like a loving kindness meditation where you formally practice having a sense of connection to others. She wasn't interested. And then I looked at her and I said, is there anyone you can help? And she lit up. And she said, well, I have this elderly neighbor and maybe I can slip a note under her door and just see if I can get her groceries or something like that. And I thought, look at that. That's so interesting. We can have a power of connection that's alive and responsive in an ordinary encounter. And it is nourishing, it's replenishing, and it's joyful in its own way because of the power of connection. So I don't mean to endlessly seek pleasure, but to notice it when it arrives and allow it to be there, and to practice in ways like connection rather than loneliness and aloofness, and using that like a cloak to really open us to the kind of joy that will strengthen us. Okay, so why don't we do a little bit of meditation together? And because, as I said, there are techniques like if you feel like you're in shock, you're going through too much, you might think about breathing in those ways, like try to have your out breath longer than your in breath. I've used that a lot with people in different situations, but in ordinary practice, regular day-to-day practice, we don't always do that at all, but more use the natural breath, however it's appearing, as a kind of stabilizing anchor for us as our energy may be swirling. So let's sit together. You can close your eyes or not, however you feel most at ease. And we'll start just by listening to sound. It could be the sound of my voice or other sounds. It's a way of relaxing deep inside, allowing our experience to come and go. Of course, we don't like some sounds, we like others, but we don't have to chase after them to hold on or push away. Just let them come, let them go. If you're not responsible for responding to the sound, just let it wash through you. Bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting, whatever sensations you discover. See if you can feel the earth supporting you. Feel space touching you. Usually we think about touching space, we think about picking up a finger and poking it in the air, but space is already touching us. We just need to receive it. Bring your attention to your hands and see if you can make the shift from the more conceptual level to the world of direct sensation, picking up pulsing, throbbing, warmth, coolness, whatever it might be. You don't have to name these things, but feel them. And on that same level of feeling sensations, bring your attention to the feeling of the breath, just the normal, natural breath. Wherever you feel it most distinctly, the nostrils, the chest, or the abdomen. You can find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. See if you can feel one breath. Without concern for what's already gone by, without leaning forward for even the very next breath, just this one. The word is rest. You don't have to worry about what's already gone by or lean forward for even the very next breath, just this one. And if you get distracted, lost in thought, spun out in a fantasy, or you fall asleep, truly don't worry about it. Once you recognize you've been gone, see if you can gently let go. And with compassion toward yourself, return your attention to the feeling of the breath. We let go and we begin again. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the meditation. So thank you. And it's time for some questions.
We have a first question, which comes back to the title of the session about practicing the Dharma in times of uncertainty. You spoke in depth about compassion and joy. Would you say more about the relationship between the Dharma and uncertainty?
Okay, so the Dharma is the word that's often used for the Buddhist teaching or for the truth of things, the laws of nature. And another meaning of the word Dharma is that which supports us, that which sustains us. So this is like in the beginning of the pandemic. I was in New York City, and that day that I was teaching that class, I'm right now in Barre, Massachusetts. The Insight Meditation Society is just next door to me through the woods, and I have a house here. So I was in New York, and I thought, maybe I'll go up to Barre for 2 weeks and ride this out, then it'll be over. So I came up here, I think it was March 14th when I came. The retreat center was still open. It had closed maybe 2 days later. And I came up with my snow boots, in March. Uh, and, I was here for a very long time. And the question I would ask myself over and over again was, what can I rely on? What, in the midst of all this change, my plans were gone. This retreat center, which I co-founded in 1976, was closed. I didn't know if it was ever going to open again. My life is teaching. I mean, I wasn't used to teaching on Zoom, and it was um, like, what can I rely on? What's going to support me? What's going to sustain me? Using that deeper meaning of Dharma. And I really thought deeply about it, and I thought about my practice. I experienced that every day doing some practice. In other words, taking my more abstract values and bringing them to life every single day was sustaining me. Um, and then there were things I really had come to understand. Things like compassion is not a weakness. It truly isn't. But it was hard, it's hard to remember sometimes. And I thought, okay, how can I live this? How can I make this real? And I undertook certain disciplines, like not just to write an email and press send, you know, um, but to write it, read it again, think about what it might feel like to be the recipient of it. And if necessary, rewrite it. I always have to rewrite it, it seems, because it's a very terse kind of medium. Things like that, bringing them alive. One of the things we all come to understand in Dharma is how much everything is changing. It's impermanent. We have sorrowful experiences and they're so strong, and we think this is the way it's going to feel forever. It's not, and the other face of change, not just how fleeting everything is and how we can't hold on to anything. The other face of change is beginnings and renewals and openings and possibilities. And I wouldn't say it's my conditioned tendency to go there, but reminding myself, okay, let's take in both, not to overlook the pain ever, but, or be kind of, what do they call it, bright siding it, but to take in both, not to just get subsumed in the difficulty that's happening right now, to open to it, to be present with it, see what I might do, and also remember nothing is permanent, and that, look at that, there's also the ways people came together here, or uh, so many things that were kind of a more joyful side of things.
Thank you. Our next question is, when someone finds themselves in a contracted state, feeling those feelings of limited options, limited possibilities, a sense of what's possible is dimmed, what are the best steps to take oneself out of that contracted state?
I'll go back to that image of the ministry of presence, so it's like try to relate to that state itself differently rather than a cascade of reactivity. I shouldn't be having this. I'm the only one that has, those things may arise, but rather than getting sucked into them, it's like having a little bit of curiosity about the state itself and try to explore it. Um, what does it feel like? Because that will also be the birth of compassion uh, for yourself and for others. What does it feel like when I feel so shut down? And can I respond with a kind of presence and compassion? And that will help you when you see other people, being kind of shut down and to respond in that way. Sometimes our effort to get out of something is a little too pressured. And, we might take steps, we might need steps to kind of bring our system into greater balance. But I would start with just trying to be with the state and understand it more and feel it with more compassion for yourself. And that tends to open doors to other possibilities. There's a word in Pali, the language of the original Buddhist text, called papancha. It means proliferation. And one translator I heard once describe it as the imperialistic tendency of mind, where something arises and the whole world is taken over. And the example I usually use about that, I was teaching with my colleague, Joseph Goldstein, somewhere. And Joseph and I were sitting in the kitchen having a cup of tea when someone came into the kitchen in some distress. And he said to Joseph, I just had this really terrible experience. So Joseph said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I felt all this tension in my jaw. And I realized what an incredibly uptight person I am and how I always have been and I always will be. And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And he said, yes. And I've never been able to get close to people and it's never going to change. And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? It was really interesting for me watching them go back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Joseph said something to him like, why are you adding a miserable self-image to a painful experience? It's like painful enough to feel all that tension in your jaw. But on top of that, now you're going to be alone for the rest of your life. So one way we talk about mindfulness is look for the add-ons. Can you see that proliferation, because it'll come up, and not buy into it so much, but not worry about the presence of the original distressing experience of body or mind. You feel closed down, you feel limited options. That's the original experience. And look at what you might be adding to it, because that's where our power lies, is in relinquishing some of those add-ons.
Thank you. Our next question is, given the polarity that is present in the United States right now as the election nears, how can we help those who are lost at the extremes of this polarity so they can move toward a more harmonious state within themselves and with others?
This is difficult. It never hurts to understand there are causes and conditions for everything. And that rather than feeling so isolated, we can actually listen, not to, bombastic presentations. You don't have to listen to those. But to listen doesn't mean to agree. It doesn't mean giving up your own value system. It doesn't mean pretending that everything's going to mush together, and that there are no views that are harmful. There's some views that are extremely harmful. But it also, might mean not being self-righteous or sanctimonious about one's own views. And looking at causes and conditions within oneself, within situations, is the best that we can discern. It's a little tricky to talk about helping someone else, like come to harmony. I mean, the most effective means is always in our own being and the way we present. And Ram Dass used to have this saying based on it was a letter someone had written him saying, My family hates me when I'm a Buddhist, but they love me when I'm a Buddha. So as hard as it is, it sometimes comes down to that. It's one's own presence, even as you're being clear, about perhaps your own view. Um, but it's a time, it's quite a time.
Thank you. Next question picks up on your reference to the fact that you have taught in schools, and the participant is wondering if there are any particular aspects of self-compassion or mindfulness that you notice were particularly effective and particularly welcomed by the school system.
Well, I haven't taught much in schools. Other people have, and I've tried to support them, but I have taught a little bit in schools. Um, and I went to Parkland, interestingly enough. I was working with the survivors of gun violence, the community there, and I was in one woman's house whose husband had been killed in the school shooting. And she just happened to be a school teacher, so she was talking about the mindfulness program at the school. And um, she she said, so I said, can you give me an example of the kind of thing you teach? And she said, one example would be when a child says, I can't do that, they teach them to add yet. So instead of it being the final verdict, like I can't do that, and I'll never be able to do that, when it's something that's within range, uh, they just, introduce the word yet. So there's like something of a different perspective. And I would say, if you look at the work of the Holistic Life Foundation, which is the organization I talked about, um, they have a lot of experience. They have programs where detention has been replaced by like meditation sessions, things like that. It'd be very interesting.
Thank you for that reference to the resource. You invited us in our guided practice to feel the breath, and the participant is asking for greater illumination of what that phrase means.
It really does mean feel the sensations of the breath. If you're with the breath at the nostrils, it may be tingling, vibration, warmth, coolness. You don't need to name those things, but we actually feel those sensations. And you also may be getting an image of the breath, or you hear the sound of the breath, but those sense modalities can be more in the background as you feel the sensations of the breath. If you're with the breath at the chest or the abdomen, it may be movement, pressure, stretching, release. And again, you don't need to name these things, but that's what we're actually paying attention to is the sensations of it.
In that trajectory, is there the observation that the experience of joy and the experience of compassion also bring with them physical sensations?
Often, like when we have a strong emotion or a strong state, I don't know if they can all be called emotions, but a strong state, usually what happens in terms of our attention is that we become most interested in the situation, the story, the object that we long for, something like that. So, for example, if you have a really, really, really strong desire for a car, a new car, probably spending your time thinking, what color should I get? Do I want that kind of upholstery, that kind of upholstery? It'd be very rare to kind of pivot your attention as though to ask yourself, what does it feel like to want something so much? But that's exactly what we do in the meditative process. We make that pivot in the first area of interest is, what does it feel like in my body? And then maybe you're watching the unfolding of kind of that state and so on. So we do that if strong joy is present, if strong compassion is present. It's almost like you pivot, and there aren't always words, but it's that curiosity, like, what does it feel like in my body? And then I think it's very helpful.
You spoke about expanding the spaciousness and letting the spaciousness be infused with love. For some people, the word love is elusive. Speak to how an individual who has only a conceptual, maybe longing for love, can work with what you're talking about.
I mean, in this case, I think love would mean a connection, a very strong acknowledgement or recognition of what's happening without judgment. I don't mean without discernment. It's like we can see it for what it is, but without that harshness of the critical voice. It shouldn't be here. And why is it here? And I'm ashamed. And no one else feels this, all this stuff. So it's a sense of openness and connection. That is what I would mean by love. And I think tomorrow when we do the meditation, it's loving kindness meditation, right? Which is really about the cultivation of that kind of connection with ourselves and with others.
Yes. So I invite all of you to the guided practice session tomorrow morning from 7:30 to 8:15, in which Sharon will be guiding us in a metta loving kindness practice. Thank you so much for your profound and practical wisdom so generously shared. We look forward to being with you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.